Good evening. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Got to hold it real close. Welcome to the Tippy McMichael lecture. My name is Denise Greathouse. Before we introduce our speaker, Amanda Tyler, I want to say a little bit about the Tippy McMichael lecture series. It's named after Clifton Reed McMichael. She was nicknamed Tippy. Like her parents and her grandparents before her, she was a lifelong member of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And as a young child, she contracted polio. So as an adult, she had to rely on a wheelchair or crutches to get around. But despite that, she was able to have a full-time career. So during World War II, she worked at Fort Chaffee, and later she had a job at U.S. Steel in St. Louis. So upon her death, she left a portion of her estate as a bequest to enhance the life and the work of the church. And we're very grateful for that. I think the Tippy McMichael lecture series is one of my favorite events here at St. Paul's. So the Tippy McMichael lecture series was created from her gift as an expression of thanksgiving and as a memorial to her. The series is funded from St. Paul's Permanent Endowment Fund. And additional support is provided by occasional donations from parishioners and friends of St. Paul's. So if anyone would like to contribute to this fund, they can see me after the talk. The lecture series are an offering to the community from which St. Paul's draws its life. And they are intended to explore a wide range of spiritual issues and feature accomplished speakers from varied disciplines and different religious traditions. So tonight we are extremely grateful to have Amanda Tyler here as our guest, who's going to speak to us about a very timely and appropriate topic, Christian nationalism. So I'm going to turn this over to our rector, Evan Gardner, to introduce Amanda.
Thank you, Denise. Before I do, let me say thank you to Denise and to our St. Spats Guild and to our Tippy Committee. May we say thank you. As Denise said, this is an offering for the community, and we really want you to know that we feel like we are at our best when the community can gather here for something important like this, and that's only possible because a lot of people make that happen, so I'm really grateful to them. I don't know how long ago we scheduled Dr. Tyler's visit, but I think we did so not quite appreciating fully how timely and important her visit would be. Father Chuck Walling, Father Lowell Grisham, offered a class here at St. Paul's to talk about Christian nationalism, and they first offered it on Sunday mornings, and it filled up within about 2 days. So they had to offer a second series, which also filled up. This is a topic that we are hungry to hear about, and we're hungry to look for not only a reminder that we are right, but a reminder that there are reasons for us to be hopeful, and there's a call for us to be active in our political life, active in our faithful life. And I'm really grateful that Dr. Tyler is here to speak to us. Amanda is a Texan. Don't hold that against her. She's a Texan from Austin, Texas. She also has indeed, some of us love the Longhorns. Indeed, we wouldn't say that too loudly, but she is a native Texan, has a law degree from the University of Texas. She's a lawyer. Don't hold that against her either. But she's committed her career and her life to the work of defending religious liberty and doing that as a person who is skilled at talking not only about the political side of that, but also the faithful side of that. She is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty, which is based in Washington, but she has not too long ago moved back to Texas to be in Dallas, where she and her family live. Tonight's lecture is on Christian nationalism and the threat to American democracy. Tomorrow morning, she will be back at 10 o'clock for a lecture on the threat that Christian nationalism poses to faithful Christianity. But we're glad she's here. At the end of the evening, if you have bought one of her books, she will hang around to sign it at the table over there to my right. And if you haven't bought one yet, there are still more for sale. But join me now in saying thank you and welcome to Dr. Amanda Tyler.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you to Denise and to everyone on the committee, on the Tippy committee, for inviting me so many months ago. I do wish that this topic did not fill rooms like this, but given that it does, I'm glad that you are here. So thank you so much for taking your time and energy to gather together in person tonight, and I know we have a live stream as well, to learn and talk about this really important topic. I do have a lecture that is about 35 or 40 minutes long, and then I want to leave time for questions and answers, and often that is my favorite part of any lecture because I think that's when we really learn together about how this ideology is showing up in different communities and in different ways. So on this first slide, which has been up here for a while, hopefully you've seen that there are lots of ways to learn more about the work of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which is a mouthful, so we often just go by BJC. We are a almost 90-year-old education and advocacy organization that's headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And our work is about faith, freedom for all. A faith-based organization that cares about religious freedom, but really for everyone, for people from all religious backgrounds and people who don't claim a religious background as well. And for most of our history, our work has been centered on legislative and legal advocacy in the halls of power. But almost 6 years ago now, we started a campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And when we did this, we really thought, we were inspired in part by the words of James Baldwin, who once said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced. And in 2019, coming off of a series of violent attacks, deadly attacks at houses of worship, dating all the way back to 2015 at Mother Emanuel AME Church, the violence at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, and then, of course, the Tree of Life shooting in 2018, we really felt convicted that it was imperative to call out Christian nationalism as a driving ideology for these violent attacks and as an urgent threat to religious freedom, to American democracy, but also to an authentic Christian witness. And so part of what we do at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is try to provide some definitions and common understanding to this. And I'm thrilled to learn that a number of you have already used some of the resources at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the curriculum. So some of this, it might be a bit of a review, but hopefully this will be something that's important to put into current context. So I do want to give some definitions because I think it's really important that we have, at least for our conversation tonight, some common understanding when I use these terms. So I want to start with a definition of religious nationalism, which just very generally is a fusion of national and religious identities and goals, and it's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. I think in the Christian context, we can date Christian nationalism at least back to the time of Constantine, the time that the emperor, those in power, took on the Christian religion and used it as an instrument of power and used it in violent means at some times as a means of exclusion, of determining who was in and who was out, and that it was based on some kind of religious identity. But we can also look around the world today and see a number of examples of religious nationalism. And a non-exclusive list includes Russia, India, Hungary, a number of African countries, including Zambia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, and Israel. And so there are so many examples of religious nationalism around the world. But for most of the conversation tonight, I want to center on American Christian nationalism, while also acknowledging that those religious nationalisms from abroad and the authoritarian regimes that run them are influencing American Christian nationalism, and American Christian nationalism is influencing those regimes as well. So a definition of Christian nationalism that we use at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is this one. It's a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. You see a QR code here. This takes you to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website, where there are more materials available to help define this term. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, and I'm putting that in quotes, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who holds certain fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with certain conservative political priorities. Now note that just to hold conservative political beliefs or views does not mean that one is embracing Christian nationalism necessarily. But to believe that someone has to hold those beliefs in order to be a real American is a sign of Christian nationalism. I want to talk also about white Christian nationalism, because in the American context, I do not think we can understand Christian nationalism without also talking about white supremacy and racial subjugation. And that's because the ideology of Christian nationalism is very old. It is a relatively new term for a very old ideology. In the American context, I said in the world context, I think we can date it back to Constantine. In the American context, I think we can date it back to the doctrine of discovery, which was the deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to come and steal native land, to kill the native inhabitants, to kidnap Africans and put them into slavery here, that it was God's will to propagate slavery in the United States, and to continue with segregation and lynchings and all of that. So all of that together shows this long, long history of white supremacy being bound up in this gross distortion of Christian religion, of using Christian texts to justify oppression, to justify violence. We can also look back for a really stark example of white Christian nationalism to the KKK. I know the KKK remains an active organization today, but 100 years ago, it was a mainstream active organization in this country, millions of members of the KKK. And it had the same toxic blend of Christianity and Christian nationalism and Christian symbols with violence, and this ideology of belonging, of who belongs and who doesn't. And of course, the violence of the KKK was centered not just on Black Americans, but also on Catholics and also on Jewish Americans. And they used their gross distortion and their gross misreading of the Bible to justify their violent acts. And so white Christian nationalism is very old in the American context. I want to talk next about some of the markers of Christian nationalism. And one is this heavy reliance on a mythological history of America as a quote-unquote Christian nation. Now, when someone says America is a Christian nation, 9 times out of 10, they are not talking about that in a demographic sense or a descriptive sense. If what they meant was a majority of Americans are Christians, then that is correct compared to when we look at actual social science surveys that a majority of Americans still do claim a kind of Christian identity. Of course, there's a lot of variation about what kind of Christianity we're talking about, a lot of different expressions of Christianity in America's pluralistic democracy. But when people say America's a Christian nation, most times that's not what they mean. Rather, they mean that America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. There's a very heavy emphasis on the idea of God's providence, that God loves America best, that God blesses America, that God has a special plan for America and God's larger vision for the world, that it is important that America and the USA succeed if God's vision for the world is going to be accomplished. These are all pieces of this Christian nation mythology, and often the historical account of America as a Christian nation is simply not good history. It is a cherry-picked version of history. It is a history by anecdote and cherry-picked quotes that are taken out of context. And it really betrays a more honest and candid reading of American history, including America's constitutional history. So at the founding of the country, when the new United States was setting up its constitution, it had a choice to make. Would it continue the arrangement of religion and government that was present in the colonies, or would it do something different? So in the colonies, there were, in most of the colonies, a form of established religion, where there was an official religion in the colony that was supported by state or the colony's tax dollars, and that was enforced on everyone else. And religious dissenters that included people like Baptists and Presbyterians and Quakers, they were often discriminated against, sometimes fined, sometimes jailed, sometimes whipped, if they did not go along with the established religion of the colony. There's a long history. From the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, there's a long history of Baptists speaking truth to power. Baptists who, for instance, in the colony of Virginia, refused to get a license to preach from the colonial authorities because they believed that no civil authority was needed to license them to preach, that they received their authority to preach from God and not from the civil authority. And their decision not to get those licenses often ended them in jail, where they continued to preach, and by what the fables say, that they converted a lot of people outside the jailhouse doors because of their preaching in the jails. So there is this long history of a different choice being made, a choice to disestablish religion. And we can look at the historical record to know this, but we can also look at the constitutional text itself. So, if it were true that America was indeed meant to be a Christian nation, then one might expect to find evidence of that in the founding document, in the U.S. Constitution. But in the U.S. Constitution, there is no mention of God, there is no mention of Christianity, and the only mention of religion is in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which says there will be no religious tests for public office. And so I think this is the best argument, not to go quote for quote to think about, was America a Christian nation and how religious were different founders, but rather to say the founders and the framers of the Constitution were very smart men. And if they wanted, indeed, to form a Christian nation, this is about the most ineffective way they possibly could do so, to ban religious tests from the very beginning. But they also knew that that alone was not enough to protect religious freedom in this pluralistic democracy. And so we have the First Amendment, and specifically the first 16 words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 2 clauses, a no establishment clause and a free exercise clause, that work together to give us the separation of church and state. This idea that it won't be the job of government to do religion, and it won't be the job of religion to do government. That these are 2 separate spheres, and that to protect everyone's religious freedom, we need to be sure that the government stays neutral when it comes to religion. So this history, this constitutional framework, is completely undercut by Christian nationalism. They are incompatible. We cannot have full religious freedom in this country if we continue to have rampant Christian nationalism. Tomorrow, and I do hope that a number of you are able to join us tomorrow, I am going to talk more specifically about the threat that Christian nationalism poses to an authentic Christian witness. But tonight, I want to talk specifically about the threat to American democracy. And I think as we think about taking this on, I think it's very important that we distinguish between Christian nationalism and patriotism. And I think that definitions are also helpful here. So I'm going to define patriotism very generally as a love of country. And like all kinds of love, it cannot be forced. It has to be a free choice. Like all kinds of love, there are many different ways to express love of country. They can be symbolic, like waving an American flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, but they can also be expressive, using our First Amendment rights, including our rights of assembly and protest. Love of country, patriotism, can mean that we love our country so much we want better for it, that we want our country to live up to our constitutional ideals. And so I think it is important that we not sacrifice a concept of patriotism in our work to dismantle Christian nationalism. But it's also important, again, that we not try to force patriotism on our fellow citizens, right? It is not a requirement of citizenship to feel patriotic. But for those of us who do feel a sense of patriotism, we should not shirk away from it. And in fact, I think we should lean into those values as we push back against Christian nationalism. But in doing so, we should not veer into the unhealthy waters of nationalism. And I define nationalism here as an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all other allegiances, and for those of us who are Christians, including our allegiance to Jesus. It's important because we should not merge our religious and political authority into one. That leads to idolatry. It leads us to put the needs of the nation over our call as Christians, to love God through love of neighbor. And so I often ask, particularly Christian audiences, is your patriotism causing you to sacrifice or forego your religious convictions? If it is, then it is no longer a healthy sense of patriotism. It is veering into these unhealthy waters of nationalism that are dangerous not just to American democracy, but also to our Christian faith. I think it's helpful, as we're understanding Christian nationalism, to also understand how prevalent it is in our country today. And we are very fortunate over the last several years to have a number of researchers who have done really well done social science surveys in the field to try to measure Christian nationalism. Now, measuring for Christian nationalism is somewhat complicated, right? You don't just ask people, are you a Christian nationalist? Check yes or no. Rather, they give them certain statements and say, how much do you agree or disagree with these statements? And these 5 statements are from the most recent poll that was just updated and released last month in February from PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute. And so the 5 statements that people are asked to say how much they agree or disagree are these: that the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. A note about a few of these. So these are then used. People can say strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. The last statement here is meant to kind of test or measure one of the most extreme versions of Christian nationalism out there today. Sometimes it's called dominionism. Sometimes it's called New Apostolic Reformation. Sometimes it's called the Seven Mountains Mandate. You might have heard of some of these different terms. But it basically says what this says, that it is the role of Christians to exercise dominion over government, over education, over business, over family, over every segment of American life. And so I point that out to say, as we look at the numbers in a moment, that really is, I think, a very extreme version of Christian nationalism. But you don't have to believe that to be labeled as someone who is embracing Christian nationalism. Let me show you the results here. Again, this was a survey of more than 22,000 Americans conducted in 2024, released just last month. And people who strongly agreed with all of those statements are called adherents to Christian nationalism. They make up 10% of the American population, according to this survey. That is, I think, an alarmingly high number given how extreme those statements are. But it is also the smallest segment of, so there's good news, bad news there, right? Sympathizers agree, or maybe strongly agree with some of them, but not all of those statements. And then we have skeptics, and then we have rejectors. So a few things to note, and there are other studies and surveys, including by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who wrote, I think, one of the best and early books on understanding Christian nationalism. And their methodologies and their results are pretty much the same and have been consistent over the last several years. Because in all of their surveys, the smallest group is always those who are most embracing of Christian nationalism. And the biggest group of Americans are those in the middle, right? Those who are skeptical or sympathizing. But they make up, almost 60% of America's population. And then we have a healthy number of people who have totally rejected Christian nationalism. Now, in this particular survey, they have grouped together sympathizers and adherents as kind of the Christian nationalism score for the United States. So you will notice as I talk about this tonight, as I write about it in the book, I do not label people as Christian nationalists. And that's for a number of reasons. One, to embrace Christian nationalism is not an immutable characteristic, right? It's not something that you are born with. It is not something that you cannot change through active work in your life. And so to label someone as a Christian nationalist, I think, is not appropriate or accurate to the problem. It's also not helpful, right, in actually trying to bring people along a continuum of understanding and learning. And it also lets us off the hook, right? Because here's the deal. This survey is a snapshot in time of a certain set of people. Every single one of us have opportunities every day to embrace or reject Christian nationalism. And if we use it as a label, then we don't include ourselves in the overall project of working to reject and dismantle Christian nationalism. But I want you to keep that 30% in mind, because I'm going to show you, and I've just added these to my lecture, because I often find when we get to the question and answer, people are really curious about the survey parts. So I wanted to give you a little more data to give you a sense of it. But if you're really interested in this topic, you can go and look at prri.org, and you can read all. They really do great work. So this next chart, which I know you can't see, but maybe you can see the colors, right? So this is Christian nationalism orientations by education, age, and race. And so it is true, again, on each of these, on the top, you can see all Americans. Again, if you look at adherents and sympathizers together, that's 30%. We see that the more education people have, the less likely they are to be embracing Christian nationalism. We look at age. We see that the younger someone is, the less likely they are to embrace Christian nationalism. But an asterisk, that youngest group, 18 to 29, is actually a little bit more embracing than the 30 to 49. So, and that, I do want to talk about that as it relates to how we see Christian nationalism showing up in public education. And then the last segment is by race. And this may be surprising to a lot of people. It was surprising to me to see it in numbers. But respondents who are black were actually more likely to embrace Christian nationalism than respondents who are white in the overall. Now, I want to do a very big caveat. How that relates to positions on things is very different. So the way that PRRI looks at it, for instance, is they look at correlates. So how likely is someone who embraces Christian nationalism, for instance, likely to hold views that align with anti-black racism? Well, if you are white and embrace Christian nationalism, you are more likely to hold views consistent with anti-black racism than if you are black and embrace Christian nationalism. So just because you embrace some of these ideas does not mean that you embrace all of the same policies and ideologies on different points. So I just want to caveat that. But I think what's more interesting than kind of the relative numbers, because they're all about the same by different racial groups, is that it does cut across every racial group. And here, this is religious affiliation. So again, all Americans are at the top. You see 30%. Probably not surprising. The religious group that most embraces it by a lot, 65%, are white evangelical Protestants. The next one is Hispanic Protestants, which are very influenced by white evangelical Protestantism. Then Black Protestants, Latter-day Saints, white Catholics, and then white mainline non-evangelical Protestant. But again, they are 30%, which is exactly what the national average is, 30%. More likely to be sympathizers than adherents, but still on that end of the spectrum. And then we go all the way down, and the religious group least likely to be embracing Christian nationalism or Unitarian Universalists. But this is, I think, very interesting to look at this and how it compares to different religious affiliations. I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding that white Christian nationalism is only a problem with white evangelical Protestants. It is a big problem with white evangelical Protestants, but it is also a problem with all Christian denominations. And so it is up to all of us to do hard work to try to dismantle it. Finally, I want to look at Christian nationalism orientations by part of the country. Okay, so again, keep in mind your 30% here. That's the national average. There are some states that are way over the national average. And I'm probably not breaking news to you to let you know that Arkansas is one of those states. In fact, it is, from the most recent, it is the 4th highest in the country. Mississippi, Oklahoma, Louisiana, then Arkansas, then West Virginia, and then North Dakota are way over the national average. I will say, because I looked at the numbers, I was curious. I told you earlier it's 22,000 Americans. In Arkansas, and they tried to, they're distributed across the country. In Arkansas, that means that they asked 238 people from Arkansas. So we're really extrapolating views from interviews with 238 people. But I will say they did this survey the year before, and it's pretty consistent. It was about 49% last time, too. But I show this map, too, for people to see, while they're definitely, you can see the states that are blue or dark blue are the ones who are most embracing of Christian nationalism. There's a definite geographic trend about where those states are. And it is also everywhere, right? That there are high numbers all over the country. It is not a problem in just one geographic area. I also point out, and I use my home state as Texas as an example. I personally think that the government in Texas is by far the most Christian nationalist government in the United States today, personally, and how much Christian nationalism is influencing the policies in Texas. It is not by accident. There are billionaires who have funded a lot of races to install people who hold Christian nationalist views into office. But Texas, a conservative state, a red state, is 37%, right? That means 63% are moving away from Christian nationalism. That is a surprise to a lot of people to know that. And so this is one of the ways that Christian nationalism is very anti-democratic. It does not reflect the views of a majority of people. It is about power. And so those who have gained power in Texas hold these views and are therefore able to enact a disproportionate impact on the lives of everyone else who lives in that state. This is also true when we look at the country at large. And I will talk in a moment at our current context and how we see Christian nationalism showing up at the federal level as well. But when you look at the country at a large and you see only 30% of Americans are really embracing these views, that is not being reflected by the leadership in the White House, by leadership in the House of Representatives, even in unelected places as well, like the US Supreme Court. So now I do want to talk about some specific examples of Christian nationalism. And I think one of the places that many people first started talking about Christian nationalism was in the wake of January 6, 2021. And that's because it was impossible to miss the symbols of Christianity and Christian nationalism that were present on that day. And in the months afterwards, Baptist Joint Committee worked very closely with the Freedom from Religion Foundation to put out a report detailing all the examples of Christian nationalism, not just on January 6th, but in all the lead-up rallies, that it was very much a concerted strategy to use the language of Christian nationalism, the songs, the liturgies, the prayers, as a way to organize disparate groups of people into a common cause, to take what was a political cause and infuse it with religious fervor. And it was that, I believe, that religious fervor that really worked to intensify the violence on that day. That people were there not just because of their political views, but because they believed that God had ordained Donald Trump to be president, that any result that did not end with him in the White House was therefore illegitimate, and that they were entitled to use any means necessary, including violence, to overthrow the will of the people and to install him into office. And I was thrilled to meet some members of the FFRF chapter here today and learn that it's one of the strongest chapters in the country. So FFRF has been a strong partner with BJC in doing this work and pointing out all of these ways that Christian nationalism is an attack on our democratic institutions. And we know that the threat to free and fair elections and democratic institutions did not end on January 6, 2021. We saw in the lead up to the 2024 election for years continuing to tell the big lie that the election had been stolen and continue to say that there were people who were prophesying that Donald Trump would be president, again, sowing this idea that God had already ordained an election result, which is itself an attack on democracy, taking the vote away from people and saying if any result had been different, that there would have been violence. And I think we all know that if the result had been different, there would have been a violent attempt to change the election result. Because Trump won a free and fair election, we did not see that violence. But the violence and the damage done to our democratic institutions has been done and will continue to play a role in taking the vote away from people in the future, in a way of really intimidation, in a way that if Trump or Trump's chosen candidate isn't elected, that there will be violence. And that specter of violence, I think, is something that continues to be an urgent threat to American democracy. But I want to give you another example that's not just January 6th, and I did write about this in my book, but Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson holds a lot of Christian nationalist views. I talked earlier about dominionism and New Apostolic Reformation. There is a flag for that movement. It is called an Appeal to Heaven flag. It was present on January 6th, and it currently, I guess I should fact check myself and make sure it's still there, but for a long time, and I believe still currently, it hangs outside of Mike Johnson's office. Right, so he very proudly is associating himself with this movement. Before he went to Congress, he was an attorney with a legal organization called Alliance Defending Freedom, which also propagates a lot of Christian nationalist views through their legal advocacy. He himself is a proponent of the Christian nation mythology and the pseudo-history. But when he was being sworn into office and gave his first speech from the dais in the U.S. House of Representatives, he said to all of the lawmakers assembled, quote, he said, I believe that Scripture, the Bible, is very clear that God is the one who raises up those in authority. He raised up each of you, all of us. This is an attack on American democracy, to say that God has placed people in the House of Representatives, not that the people who elected them have placed them in the U.S. House of Representatives. It confuses, again, religious and political authority. And it may feel subtle. It didn't feel subtle to me when I heard it. But this is an attack on American democracy and pluralism. It is also an attack on American democracy and religious pluralism to suggest that one has to be a Christian to be a real American, right? The foundational idea, and I believe it's an ideal that has never been fully realized in this country because of Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism. But the foundational ideal, or one of them, is that we all should have equal belonging in this country, regardless of what we believe, how we worship, or whether we identify as religious or not. That it is not religion that defines us as Americans. That religion is important, for sure, and that for those of us who want to be religious, we are free to pursue our religious lives without the influence of government. But that factor does not define what it means to be an American. That idea is attacked by Christian nationalism, and it often results in violence, particularly against religious minorities, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bias, anyone who is viewed outside of that very narrow circle of belonging. We're also seeing examples of how Christian theology and Christian texts are being used as the basis for law and policy. And this is where I really want to explain the difference between faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism. So the picture on the left is also from January 6th, but from 2 years later, January 6, 2023, when a group of us as religious leaders gathered across the Capitol at dawn in a vigil to remember what happened on January 6th and to bear witness to how Christian nationalism influenced Christian nationalism, the attack on the Capitol, and to commit ourselves to continuing to work to dismantle it. January 6, 2023 was just a couple of weeks after the January 6 Select Committee issued their final report. I and many others submitted testimony to the January 6 Select Committee about how Christian nationalism influenced the insurrection. And we were all very disappointed that there was no mention of Christian nationalism in the committee's final report. And so I think this showed that it takes the courage and the speaking out from people in the American public, including religious leaders, and especially including Christians, to explain how Christian nationalism is not Christianity, and to explain how it is our call as Christians to dismantle Christian nationalism, because we do care about American democracy, because we do care about the pluralism that is protected by the U.S. Constitution. But there's a difference between bringing our faith-based selves into the public square, as we did that morning, in that cold morning in January, and in advocating that our own religious views be represented in law and policy. And I mean whether there are progressive views or conservative views, right? That it is not the job of government to reflect any one particular religious view. And I want to give you just a few examples of how we are seeing that play out today. We see it in legislation at the state level, often now in this time of abortion bans that define life as beginning at conception. That is a religious view. And it is a religious view that is not shared even by all religions. But when the government picks and chooses between religious views and chooses one to enact in law and policy, that is an example of Christian nationalism. We see it in state laws and now also in federal policy, trying to say that there are only two immutable genders and enacting discriminatory laws against transgender people on that basis, using scripture as the reason, saying, as Mike Johnson did, that the Bible tells us that there are two genders. That is an example of Christian nationalism. There is also a strong link between immigration policy and violence against immigrants and people from other faith groups and Christian nationalism. This really dangerous theory called the replacement theory, the Great Replacement Theory, and how linked that is to ideas of Christian nationalism. Again, that only certain people belong in the United States and that was ordained by God from the beginning. And we are seeing that play out in horrific ways right now in our country, in communities across this country, when we see violence being enacted against immigrants, being treated in completely inhumane ways. And we see it also how this impacts the religious freedom of all Americans with a new policy that allows immigration officials to go into sensitive locations, including houses of worship, to conduct raids and arrests. This is a violation of religious freedom, of human rights, and it is all tied in with this really dangerous ideology. So those are just a few of the examples. I think we could be here all night long talking about a lot of different policies and the overlap and the intersection with this ideology and how it is driving a lot of the policies that we are seeing being enacted today. I also, though, want to talk about very quickly about how we're seeing Christian nationalism show up in issues impacting our public schools. This is a very concerted effort by those who are driving Christian nationalism to pursue policies at the public school level. They've been doing it for several years, and their efforts are gaining steam. So I want to give you a few examples here of how we're seeing it show up. We see it in efforts to teach the Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest history. Often when you see the words Judeo-Christian, that is often a buzzword or should be a yellow flag that there could be Christian nationalism in the legislation that you're reading. And I want to explain that a little. So Judeo-Christian, my friend Ibu Patel at Interfaith America, he did a lecture with BJC and kind of explained the history of this term. And when it was first introduced in the early 20th century, it really was meant to be an inclusive term. Because up to that point, because of white Christian nationalism, white Protestants were really the only ones who were viewed as really fully belonging. And so this idea of Judeo-Christian was meant to enlarge that circle of belonging to include American Catholics and American Jews who had not been included previously. But now we are really seeing this term used in, I think, very misleading ways that have a window dressing of inclusivity, saying, oh, no, it's not just Christian, we're including Jewish people too. Of course, you're also excluding a lot of people who don't fall into those two religions. But the term Judeo-Christian is actually quite anti-Semitic, and it is attacking of Judaism as well. That's because Judaism is its own unique religion. It is not a modifier of Christianity. And often when we see policies that use this Judeo-Christian window dressing, whenever they have references to Judaism, they are through a Christian lens, which is not the correct lens to view Judaism through. And so that is often something to watch out for. We're seeing it in laws that are requiring the posting of "In God We Trust" in public school classrooms, as well as recently the state of Louisiana became the first state to pass legislation requiring the posting of the Ten Commandments. A bill that is, or an effort, law that is on hold because it has been challenged in the courts, and the courts in the district court in Louisiana ruled it unconstitutional based on Supreme Court precedent. And so it is, that case is working its way through the system. We see it in content bans and in book bans. And we also see it in this policy that would promote the hiring or accepting as volunteers in schools, school chaplains. I noted in preparing for tonight that there is a bill pending in the Arkansas legislature right now, a school chaplain law bill. I am delighted to tell you that on first vote, it failed by a 13-11 vote. And that's a real success story. But the legislative session is not over. So I want this to be an action alert to everyone in this room to learn more about SB 164 and to advocate against it. Because chaplaincy is a wonderful profession, and it belongs in certain contexts where people are not able to access their religion, and chaplaincy is done by people who are trained as chaplains, go through a lot of training and specialized work to do it, and who can do it in an interfaith way. So we see it done very well in the military, in hospitals. We see it in prisons. Public schools are not the right context for chaplains, right? Public school children go home every night to their families. They are able to access religion. And what we really need are more resources put into mental health counselors, and these programs often take money away from those programs. So please learn more about that bill and be active there. And then I'm going to end with just some other ideas on what we can do to push back against Christian nationalism. That is the work of our campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We started it as mostly an awareness campaign. We have moved it into more action in ways for people to get more directly involved. An entry point to the campaign, if you haven't done it already, is to sign our statement. It is not the only entry point, but if you are a Christian, you can be a Christian against Christian nationalism by signing our statement of unifying principles. It is not a statement of faith. We have people who have signed this statement from more than 6 dozen different expressions of Christianity. There is no one statement of faith that can unite all these people. This is a statement of unifying principles. And so I invite you to join us by signing this statement. If you are not a Christian, or if you don't want to sign the statement, you can also join us by just subscribing to get our action alerts. We are starting to send more action alerts that are geographically specific, so we'll send some that have to do with federal policy. But for instance, if we see something moving with this school chaplain bill, we can email you directly to give you more information about that. Another resource is the book that I wrote. So I wrote this book, How to End Christian Nationalism, because I spoke to so many people who, after hearing all of this, or maybe they even came to the meeting knowing it was a problem, they said, but what can I do? And so I wrote this book with actionable steps, ideas on how to make progress against what is a huge problem and is a very old problem, and that is really going to require all of us working together. And so I'm thrilled there are copies here, but it's also available wherever you get your books and in all the formats that you get your books, including audiobook. And finally, and this is where I'm really excited and where a lot of our work at the campaign is going, is into helping people who are interested in forming local organizing groups in your community to push back against Christian nationalism. Just to connect with other people. But you're here tonight, so you're ready to connect with everybody in this room to push back against Christian nationalism. But if you want to continue this work and try to get a sustained group going, I suggest that you go to this QR code. There's lots of information on this page. You'll be in touch with my colleague, Joy Pettigrew, who is our community partnerships manager. This shows you where we are starting to put groups. We have a group in North Texas, in Minnesota, in Indiana, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And over the coming months, I expect this map is going to have little dots all over it. That's because we recently put out a call and we got 128 responses from people who want to start groups. It takes time for us to get all those meetings set up and to get that information. But eventually what we really want, once you're on this website, if people go to ours and they say, I wonder what's happening in Northwest Arkansas, they could find your group. And we're not looking, if there is great organizing already going on here, we can also plug into like a coalition of other organizing groups that are happening. We don't have to start something totally new, but we want to have some place where people who come to the campaign can feed into work that's actually happening on the ground. And because I think, with the overwhelm of what's happening in our country right now, we can fall into a state of feeling like there's nothing we can do. That is absolutely wrong. We can do things, and we can feel the agency of our work and democracy in action most on the local level. And so we really want people. It's not that we won't be speaking out against things that are happening in Washington. On Wednesday, I will be at a faith vigil on Capitol Hill, calling on Congress to live up to their constitutional duties and to use their Article I powers to defend American democracy. So there are things we can do on the national level, but I think there's a lot more that can be done on the local level. And so I really want to encourage anyone who's interested to learn more about that. And with that, I went over what I said I would, but I'd love to take a few questions if we have time.
Let's say thank you. Who has a question? Here I come.
I so appreciate you being here.
Let me ask you to use this so that the people watching online can hear us too.
Okay. I so appreciate you being here, straight to the point, no extra words, no fluff. Somebody who has common sense. It's just a breath of fresh air. I really appreciate you being here. But 3 words you said that are key to me: specter of violence. And that, to me, is what is happening. We expect our legislators and our elected officials to grow a backbone, grow a spine. But as Mitt Romney said, he's spending $75,000 a month to protect his family, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, his nieces and nephews. That specter of violence is the one that I think that keeps people from having that backbone and that spine. You don't want your children in the line of violence. And I'm concerned about you. We're talking the word of God, the word of the Bible I read, but that can be a threat as well. So I'm concerned about that specter of violence and why people don't act.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, as I didn't in the presentation, but then when President Trump pardoned the violent offenders on January 6th, that both openly condoned that violence, but also emboldened and empowered them to feel like there will be no consequences if their violence is in service of his goals. And so, we live in a dangerous country. Right? And we've known that for a long time. And we can look at gun violence in this country and understand that. And I do think, though, as we are thinking about taking action, it is important that we think about those in our communities and our circles who are most vulnerable to that violence and not ask them to be out front with that violence. But it's also true that working together, that we are stronger together, that we are able to push back against it, and that we have to speak out against the violence. And we can't have it normalized. And I think there are a lot of creative groups out there who are looking at ways not just to protect ourselves physically, but also to think about what are the nonviolent ways that we can create and push back to the violence. Because it is a minority of the population, but it is also a very heavily armed piece of the population, and ones that, again, are influenced by this ideology, who think it's, God's call on their life possibly to engage in this violence and to use any means necessary. So it is a sobering note. It is something that it's important for us to be mindful of. And if people of good conscience don't stand up in this moment, then we will only become a more violent society in the years to come.
Other questions? Chuck and Mel.
Part of my continuing education about Christian nationalism is that in recent months, I've read several articles and essays about the growing relationship between American oligarchs and Christian nationalism. I was wondering if you would have some comment about that.
Yeah, American oligarchs, people, do you want to name names or? I think we can imagine. Yeah, I think there is overlap for sure. I think there is this sector coming out of Silicon Valley and the tech bro culture there that has adopted a form of Christian nationalism. I am not an expert in, sorry, oh, it's an Amber Alert. We'll pray that that person is safe.
Just a minute. I know that's disruptive, but let me stop for a moment and say a prayer for those who are in need. Let us pray. Gracious God, for those who are in danger, for those who have been separated from those who care for them, may your angels protect her. May those who care for us and help us be effective in their work, that this child might be returned to her family safely. Amen.
Thank you. So I won't admit to be an expert on all this, but I do think this is an example sometimes of how an ideology is used as a permission structure to enact a kind of power. I do think it is all about power. But I have a cynical view on how Christian nationalism is really influencing some of the actors, that it is more about a pursuit of power than it is about a given theological view that they're holding. But it is something that I think there is a definite overlap. And I mean, we even see it with Musk, who gives, I think, just like kind of passing lip service to the idea. But it's more as a way of justifying his own power grab in terms that have a lot of cultural currency, right? The fact that Christians are a majority in the American culture means that by invoking Christianity in these very general terms sometimes, that they're trying to curry favor with the majority of Americans. And it's up to us, particularly those of us who claim a Christian label, to explain loudly that that is not, and I'm going to go much more in depth tomorrow on this, but that is not a reflection of the teachings of Jesus.
Right here.
I would be interested in hearing you talk about social media and maybe your thoughts about, I don't know, is there a way to be influential in that way or not, or the divisiveness, or I just want you to talk a little bit about social media if you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's here, right? And I think we've seen all of the evils and dangers of social media, and the way that misinformation and disinformation is able to travel through social media right now is very alarming, and I think is also a threat to American democracy. At the same time, it can be a way to organize against Christian nationalism. Raw numbers show that those opposed to Christian nationalism don't have the same kind of influence on these platforms as those who are pushing it. And part of that is an investment strategy, that those who are pushing Christian nationalism who've invested an enormous amount of money and energy into kind of building that up. And so I think there are certain things, I think information sharing, I mean, this might sound silly, but I heard for tonight, some people heard about this from Facebook, this event tonight. That's wonderful. You know, so information sharing about events, ways that we can plug people into in-person activity. I am a very big believer, especially in this moment, at the need for us to be in person together. And part of it is in gatherings like this tonight. Part of it is in organizing for change. Part of it is just in having coffee with someone, right? And having a real conversation. Where I don't think social media is very effective is trying to convince someone away from Christian nationalism, right? First of all, you're not really having a private conversation on social media. And you're often, I mean, not you, like in general, when you're on social media, you're posting memes or posting articles or posting facts. And that's not really, that doesn't give an opportunity for the kind of deep listening and empathy that's required to actually understand how someone is influenced by Christian nationalism and try to empathize with them. And how do we really learn and have a sense of curiosity about that? So all of that to say, I think there is a place for social media. If people are on Facebook, we do have a Christians Against Christian Nationalism private group. And there's a lot of information sharing that goes on in that private group. So I'd invite you to find that online. You know, you'll be admitted. It's not an automatic thing, but you'll be admitted to the group. And then that's a great way to hear from more people there.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I guess we are on social media, right? So, I mean, all these places, including on TikTok. So, you know, I think there are lots of different ways.
Thank you. I want to get back to your favorite subject, evangelical preachers. They've gotten louder in the last 8 years, but every once in a while we read that one has decided, despite all the shunning, to step apart and join y'all, us.
Right.
And please tell me there's some hope in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that religious leaders who are following Jesus will be discipled away from Christian nationalism, right? It's just incompatible, I believe, with a Christian walk. And so I am pleased when I see people who are speaking out against Christian nationalism, and not always using those words, but against the ideas. But we also see that there are costs to that, especially when that group, again, is overwhelmingly influenced. So 65% compared to 30% of American public. So that means for a preacher to preach a sermon against it, you know, he, and it usually is he in the white evangelical spaces, is going to risk losing his job or people leaving the church. And I think that's part of it. I think that especially for white Christians who hold so much privilege in this society, we have to realize no matter where we're speaking out from, we will likely have something to lose, you know, in doing this work. And again, I think if we're really following Jesus, we have the model of someone who was self-sacrificial in the way that he approached his ministry, in ways that I think can be a model to us to how we are supposed to actually love God and love neighbor in this moment. So I'm encouraged, as you are, when I see kind of defections, if you will, from that group. I'll also note that despite what you hear, and PRRI does great research on this, as does Pew Religion, but that sector of American Christianity is not really growing, right? That's what we've heard for a long time. We've heard about this death of the mainline church, obviously not the case here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and not the case in most communities, right? That story has been very overblown, and I think we will see churches that are willing to preach the gospel and actually live the gospel in this time will attract people to their causes, particularly young people who see through the hypocrisy, and will be more drawn to the movement.
Time for a couple more. Let me get her first.
One thing that's of concern to me as you look around this room, my guess is the average age of this crowd is pretty high. That's concerning to me. Would you comment?
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways to take action, and some of them might not come to an event on Saturday night, at the church, right? And so I think there's a bit of a self-selection in the venue, and I'm thrilled that you all self-selected to be here tonight. But I think there are lots of different ways to join the movement and to do the work. And my own experience in doing this is that this cause is really attracting a very diverse group of people to the work that we're doing. And I'm also encouraged, even in these very dark days of the early Trump administration, where I am, like many of you, all of you, incredibly concerned about what's going on, that we are seeing people show up in different ways. It is not in the large protest way that we saw 4 years ago, but it is in the way of responding to action alerts, organizing in their communities, and speaking out against injustices that we're seeing. And I think that we will continue to see that in the days to come. So be encouraged. It's really a very diverse movement that's interested in the work.
Thank you for being here. I'm also 41, by the way, so I'll be taking this back to our young adult group in Russellville.
Great.
You mentioned something that stuck out to me about not labeling them Christian nationalists because they have the ability to change. And you mentioned also the pardons. I believe 2 people did not accept the pardons. And so I was kind of curious from your experience, your discussions, what is allowing these people to see their ways and to change?
Yeah, I think largely, and I need to learn more about that and kind of how people, and I do think that there was a sense from some of the people there who got caught up in the moment and then really regretted what happened that day. I think the way to change is by personal relationship. And it's by relationship and conversation often with people whom they already know, right? And so you all know someone who is either adhering to Christian nationalism or sympathizing with it. I really think you do. You know somebody. In this state, 49% are, so. And so I think part of it is, it's not go out and try to, proselytize them, right, away from Christian nationalism. It's about having that meaningful conversation about really getting curious about why they hold certain views and listening well. And also, I think in preparing for those conversations, think about ways that you might have embraced some of these ideas in the past without even recognizing it, and being willing to share some of that back and identifying in that way. And I write about this in the book, but also just examples of my own, just again, being part of the privileged majority in the country and taking for granted, that Christian and particularly white Christianity is just the norm, and just taking for granted all of the ways that we have benefited or been privileged by that. And so I do think that personal relationship and conversation is the way to transformation.
Time for one more right here.
Comment, but inviting a response. I want to caution us against fear that leads to anger, specifically acting out of that, because I think that that's what fuels the Christian nationalism anyway. I don't think it's the positive messages of Christ, right? I think it's people being afraid that their life and their moral stance is going to get squashed somehow. And I think that if we act out of the same fear that leads to anger, that bad things can happen as well. So I want to caution on that and get your thoughts.
I agree. I think we have to, and again, speaking in a Christian space and in the book, I really am talking specifically to Christians and even more specifically to white Christians. And before we do any of the work, we have to ground ourselves in God's love. And if we, and that love that drives out fear, right? And so I think, and these are not just platitudes, this is real, like that sense of not lashing out in anger or in fear, I think that's key to the work doing. And also understanding, again, I think that helps deepen and understand this fear or this loss, or this fear, this sense of loss of privilege, loss of kind of Christian normativity in the culture, or whatever it might be, that is also driving a lot of these ideas, and trying to develop a sense of empathy with that, I think can be useful in responding in a loving way, in a way that isn't judgmental. Yes, judge the violence, right? But the person, and really seeing the common humanity in everyone that we're encountering, I think is, and the image of God in everyone that we're encountering is key to the work.
Let's say thank you one more time.
Thank you.
A few quick announcements before we break up. I'm going to tell you about 4 opportunities, some very short and some a little further away. First, if you bought a book or brought a book or would like to buy a book, Amanda is willing to sign your book, so she will be in that table on the right. That's the first. The second, as you've heard, Dr. Tyler will be back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I hope you'll be with us. The third event is on the back of your Tippy McMichael flyer. Our next Tippy speaker will be Melissa Givens, a soprano and musicologist, who will be here to perform and discuss the recovery of the importance of Florence Price, an Arkansas musician and composer, and she had to reschedule her event. Originally it was scheduled for last year, but we're glad she's coming in September. The fourth event is not published, but I want to mention that 2 weeks from today, Robert P. Jones, the founder of the PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute that Dr. Tyler mentioned, he will be in town. He'll be in Fayetteville. On Saturday, he'll be speaking at the public library in the afternoon. And on Sunday morning, he'll be here about his book, White Too Long, but again about the intersection between religion and white supremacy, and he'll be a guest here at St. Paul's, not tomorrow, but 2 weeks from tomorrow. So I hope you'll consider joining us for that as well. Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon.